plenty of opportunity to get all the pictures, all the whatever you want, but if you could just maybe stay back a little bit, particularly when the witnesses are testifying, I think that would, just in appreciation of the witnesses taking time to be here, that would be much appreciated by them. Mr. Kessler, you are recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Jordan and Ranking Member Nadler.
Pull that mic close, Mr. Kessler.
Thank you to members of the committee and to fellow witnesses, some of whom have suffered the deepest and most unfair personal losses. And thank you to Kylie Murdoch, my research assistant sitting behind me. But to members of the committee, I've got to ask, why are we here? Why are we in New York City? Yes, in this massive city of 8.5 million people piled atop each other on a speck of land barely 300 square miles in size, awful things happen, awful crimes happen, awful losses are suffered. But as unfortunate and tragic as it is, we live in a violent country like no other advanced nation, and the fact is that New York City is not only safer than most large cities in America, it is safer than most cities of any size, and on a per capita basis, New York City is safer than most of the states of the members sitting on the dais on the majority side. In 2020, for example, New York City's murder rate was 18% below the national average for the entire United States. Mr. Chairman, Ohio's murder rate was 59% higher than New York City's. Louisiana's murder rate was 251% higher than New York City's. The murder rate in Texas was 42% higher than New York City. South Carolina, 126% higher. Florida, 32% higher. Kentucky, 70% higher. North Carolina, 57% higher. Indiana, 72% higher. Arizona, 35% higher. Alabama, 119% higher. A hearing about the ravages of crime could be in Alabama with its towering homicide rate and a mass killing that just happened yesterday, or Louisville, where 5 people were murdered in the blink of an eye at a downtown bank, or the murder capital of California, which is not Los Angeles or San Francisco or Oakland, but in Speaker McCarthy's district of Kern County with its county seat of Bakersfield, and it has been the murder capital of California for 6 years running. I'm focusing on the year 2020, but it's not just that 1 year, it's the entire century. From 2000 to 2020, if New York City was a state, its murder rate would rank smack dab in the middle at 22nd in the nation and be about 1/4 the murder rate of the entire state of Mississippi. And the borough of Manhattan is even safer than the rest of New York City. From 2000 to 2020, Manhattan's murder rate would rank 30th among the 50 states. I need to say a word about guns and about the politics of crime because A, 79% of homicides are by firearm, and B, I had both the pleasure and misfortune of working on the Mike Dukakis for President campaign, and I know how potent and irresistible the issue of crime is in politics. If someone is a victim of a gun crime in New York City, dollars to donuts, that gun was not originally purchased in New York State. And I'll double down and bet that crime gun originated from either Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, or Virginia. There is massive gun trafficking that ferries guns from those 5 southern states with weak gun laws up I-95 to states like New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. And I know this because in 1996, I was working for a Brooklyn congressman from Park Slope named Chuck Schumer. And we FOIA'd the FBI data for every gun in America that was recovered in a crime and successfully traced. And we uncovered gun trafficking patterns all across the nation. And practically nothing has been done legislatively ever since except to make it harder, much harder, to get data on the origin of crime guns. That brings me to the politics of crime. Wouldn't it be great if this hearing was about how illicit guns are trafficked to places like New York City, Newark, Boston, Philly, Chicago, and how those guns terrorize the innocent people living in those places and elsewhere? That's the sort of thing Congress would do if it really cared about what was happening with regard to crime in New York City. Mr. Chairman and Mr. Nadler, there are 8.5 million people living in New York City on this tiny plot of land. Bad things happen here, no doubt. But the miracle of New York City is how well this enormous chunk of humanity mostly gets along and suffers less crime than much of the nation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Kessler. We will now proceed with 5-minute questioning. We're going to try to move through pretty quick and, like I said, stick to the 5 minutes with members. If any of our witnesses need a break, water break, restroom break, just let us know and we'll do that. We can maybe go one at a time and keep going, or maybe we'll take a 5-minute break. Just signal us and let us know. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Miss Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today and being willing to share your stories with us. I served my community as a prosecutor and as a judge, and a prosecutor has an absolute responsibility to work with the men and women of law enforcement to uphold the law, to protect the community, and to consult with crime victims and their families to be sure that their voices are heard in our criminal courts. When crimes aren't prosecuted and when judges are prevented from setting appropriate bail, or when violent criminals are released out on the street and allowed to reoffend because of reckless bail policies, the criminal justice system is failing victims of crime. But it is not just my work as a prosecutor and as a judge that informs me for this hearing today. I am also a mother. And we need to begin this hearing today by remembering that the victims of these soft on crime policies, the victims of these reckless bail reform policies, aren't just numbers. They are people and lives that are forever harmed or lost. Each of them reflects a failure in our criminal justice system. With that, Ms. Brame, I would like to return to your story. Would you please begin by sharing with us a little bit more about your son?
Excuse me, is that the way my son was murdered or my son as a person?
As a person, please.
Sergeant Hassan is the oldest of my 5. He was 35 years old at the time of his death. He is a father of 3 small children, Jason, Jordan, and Jaylani, my 3 grands. And also Hassan was a husband. He was an amazing young man. He was a personal physical trainer at Crunch Gym at the time of his murder. He was also a full-time student at Manhattan College. Hassan was a responsible, licensed, and registered gun owner, all right? He was a good guy with a gun.
Do you believe that the criminals who murdered your son received justice?
That the criminals who murdered him?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely not. You know, even the stabber, they offered him a plea deal. Instead of the 25 to life, he copped out to 20 years. Okay? The other brother is the only one who actually went to trial, and he blew trial. He lost trial, and he also got 20 to life. All right? And so, but 2 of the other defendants got completely away with what they did to my son. If you take a life, you do life. Okay? There should be no plea deals for murder.
And what
Those
about
cases need to be brought to trial.
And what about your family, Ms. Brame? Do you feel your family was treated appropriately in the criminal justice system?
Absolutely not. We were treated like garbage.
Tell me about that.
We got no answers. If it wasn't for my persistence, all right, if it wasn't for my not missing one court date, except for the one where they dropped the murder and gang assault charge against Mary Saunders because Alvin Bragg's office did not inform me that they were doing that, which is my right to know that. I didn't get a chance to give my victim impact statement when they sentenced her to that 1 year time served. Okay, so they treated us like garbage. They didn't reveal any information. I had to do a lot of research myself. That's one of the reasons why I formed my Victims' Rights Reform Council, to help others and families of homicide victims, to help them navigate that court system, because we got no services. There is no services in New York City for victims. If there is, I have no idea what they are.
Thank you, ma'am. Councilman Holden, You've called for legislation that would give judges more discretion when setting bail conditions for defendants who may pose a threat to public safety. Would you tell us a bit more about your proposals and why you believe they are important?
Well, New York State is the only state in the union that a judge cannot consider how dangerous the defendant is. So if he's committed a number of crimes before, the judge can't consider that. The only state in the union. So that's why you have repeat offenders out on the streets. This is so ridiculous, so absurd, that a judge cannot consider how dangerous an individual is who is arrested. And that's why people are walking. And so we've made proposals to our state colleagues. Let's change this. Why are we the only state in the union that does this? I mean, you have to question that. But again, so many people doing this.
Time of the gentlewoman has expired. Thank you, Mr. Holden. We'll sure you'll get more time. The chair now recognizes the ranking member from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Graham, you failed to note that as a result of D.A. Bragg's prosecution, 2 men are currently serving life sentences for the murder of your son. Mr. Kessler, in your testimony, you noted that New York City is safer than most cities and even most states in America. The police department's own data show that since D.A. Bragg took office, shootings in Manhattan have declined by 20%, homicides have declined by 16%, and the rates of virtually every other type of violent crime are lower during the first quarter of this year than they were at this time last year. In the meantime, homicide rates in places such as Ohio, Louisiana, Texas, and Arizona are much higher than in New York. As someone who studies crime trends, what do you think accounts for this disparity in safety between Manhattan and other parts of the United States?
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. So I don't think any place in this country is really safe, okay, because we're awash in guns. New York is safer, and it's, on average, New York City is safer than Ohio, Texas, many other places. I think number one is gun ownership rates, okay? So gun ownership rates in red states tend to be about twice the gun ownership rates in blue states. There are other factors as well. Poverty rates matter. Educational attainment is often a correlation with crime. And I also think that in certain states, cities in those states are starved for resources because, frankly, the governors don't really care about getting votes in those states. And so I think some of the urban areas in southern states, the amount of police that they have per capita is far less than in places like New York City, and all the resources for schools and after-school programs. But I think number one is gun ownership rates.
Thank you. How does New York City's murder rate compare to the national average?
New York City's murder rate is 18% below the national average, and I believe has been below the national average every single year since 2010, and I think several years before that, between 2000 and 2010.
How about assault?
The assault rates are lower.
And burglary?
Burglary rates are lower.
Larceny?
Lower.
And rape?
Lower.
And how do the incidence of those crimes in New York City compare to the national average?
In all of those cases, New York City's rates are lower.
How does New York City's murder rate compare to that of Ohio?
New York City's murder rate in 2020, I should say Ohio's murder rate in 2020 was 59% higher than New York City's.
And what about the rate of rape in Ohio compared to New York?
The rate of rape in Ohio was 280% higher.
Than in New York. And assault?
34% higher.
And burglary?
146% higher.
And larceny?
346% higher.
Than in New York.
Than
How
in
do
New
the
York City.
incidence rates of those crimes in New York City compare to the national averages?
Okay. New York City's murder rate is 18% below the national average. Rate of rape 58% lower. Rate of robbery is 102% higher. Rate of assault 16% lower. Rate of burglary 44% lower. Rate of larceny 71% lower. Rate of motor theft 58% lower. So lower on 6 out of the 7.
Now, let's talk specifically about violent crime. Based on your review of crime data, does New York have a higher or lower rate of violent crime than Florida?
Lower.
And what about Louisiana?
Lower.
Kentucky?
Lower.
Arizona,
Lower.
North Carolina.
Lower.
If you were able to decide or given a choice of where to hold a hearing about violent crime in America, what are some of the cities or states where you think a hearing would be most needed and most effective, and why?
Well, I think you could certainly hold hearings in places like, Louisville, very high rates. Jacksonville, very high crime rates there. There's a lot of Alabama, Mississippi, extraordinarily high murder rates in those states. Some in cities, some not in cities. New York City look, there's a lot of bad stuff that happens in the city because there's 8.5 million people here. But relative to the rest of the country, it's doing better.
And finally, according to CDC data, the states with the highest rates of gun deaths are Mississippi, Louisiana, Wyoming, Missouri, Alabama, and Alaska. What trends are you seeing with respect to gun violence generally in red states?
What we found when we looked at between 2000 and 2020 is the murder rate in red states, as defined by the 25 states that voted for Donald Trump in 2020 versus the 25 states that voted for Joe Biden. The murder rate in red states was higher than the murder rate in blue states in all 21 of those years. And over a cumulative 21-year period, it was 23% higher in those red states. And even if you took out the largest blue city in each of the red states, the murder rate was 12% higher in red states.
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. State is parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. Chairman, my parliamentary inquiry is, in light of the testimony you just heard, what is the mechanism for the committee to transfer this hearing to Ohio, where the crime rate is significantly greater than here in New York? Is there a motion?
Not a parliamentary inquiry.
It is about, I'm asking parliamentary, how do we move the venue so we can have a hearing in a city or state that has a serious crime problem? The state of Ohio.
Not a proper state of parliamentary inquiry. The gentleman's time is expired.
Appeal the ruling of the chair.
It's not appealable ruling.
Mr. Jordan, I'm sorry. If Mr. Nadler is going to make derogatory comments towards the mother of a homicide victim, he could at least allot her some time to respond.
The lady is not recognized. Hang on. Committee will be in order. Committee will be in order. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Pursuant to what you just said, I think it is important that you have an opportunity to respond to the statement by the ranking member that justice was served in the case of your loss. Ms. Blame.
Sergeant Hassan Kari is dead forever. Dead forever. There are 4 people directly responsible for his murder. 2 people is not justice. And until there is justice for the murder of my son, there will be no peace. None. All 4, I'm asking for a special prosecutor to reopen those murder and gang assault charges against Mary Saunders, and Travis Stewart. Present that evidence, present that video to a jury, and allow them to decide those homicidal maniacs' innocence or guilt. My son is dead forever. They deserve to be in prison forever. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Harrison, there's been a lot of discussion at the end of the dais about gun violence. All 3 of you at that end, were there guns involved in the murder?
No, there were not. Madeline's son was stabbed, and my boyfriend and his best friend were both stabbed.
So, knives kill.
There's a will, there's a way, and when evil wants to attack, evil is going to attack. And I would also like to say that, New York might have strict gun laws, but we also have conflicting gun laws, which I haven't heard from Ms. Fisher regarding raise the age. Immediately after the Buffalo incident, Kathy Hochul implemented a raise the age that placed a ban on purchasing certain weapons from minors. But we also have an original raise the age law that conflicts that completely because it eliminates the criminal prosecution of any minor holding an illegal weapon.
And in this state, you have a universal assault weapons ban and have for a long time. Isn't that true?
I'm not sure about the assault weapons ban. I'm sorry.
Okay, and Mr. Alba, I think your testimony was very powerful. You too were attacked by other than a gun, isn't that correct? And if you'd pause the clock.
That's correct.
I'm sorry, I can't hear
There
you.
was no gun involved.
And your response that saved your life was also not a gun. Is that correct? Well, I appreciate the fact that you were able to respond. In New York, if I understand correctly, even though you were operating a store, you were not allowed to have a weapon to protect yourself in the way of a gun. Is that correct? And I'd like to, go ahead.
Can you please repeat the question?
Yes, in New York, you defended yourself with a knife because as a store operator, you were not allowed to have a gun. Is that correct? Okay, but you don't own a gun. Is that correct?
Yeah, he doesn't own a gun. He doesn't really know much.
Okay, thank you. And then I think, Mr. Holden, you probably could answer this. According to the figures we were given earlier, at least 6,000 of the 19,000 weapons were New York-based weapons. Is it true that guns go missing and get stolen and get straw purchased here in New York in spite of the most stringent laws in the country?
Exactly. You're not going to get every gun off the street. The iron pipeline is a problem. We know that. But a lot of guns come from New York City. A lot of guns are made in New York City, put together in New York City. The problem we have in New York State and New York City is we have some of the toughest gun laws in the nation, but they don't enforce them. The courts are not enforcing them. The DAs are not enforcing them. So this is a big problem. You have multiple shootings, one individual, 5 arrests for shootings, and he's back on the street.
Well, and
how is that working?
Yeah, and Mr. Giacomo, you represent so many of our brave men and women in blue. Can you comment on that failure to enforce existing laws leading to the kind of both gun and non-gun violence that New York is seeing?
Like we said earlier, it was brought out in the hearing that New York City police and detectives took an amazing amount of firearms off the streets. And every time they do that, they put their life in harm's way. They confront an armed felon, and they put their life in harm's way. Just for that individual to walk out the door the next day and again get a firearm and use it either in a robbery or in a gang-related violence.
And Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to take all the time that should have been paused, but I do want to comment that a lot has been made about moving the venue or other places we could be, and I will reiterate on behalf of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, yes, we could be having this in Los Angeles. Yes, we could be having it in San Francisco. There are other places around the country in which systematically district attorneys are not enforcing the laws and leading to the kind of terrible stories we're hearing here today. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Lofgren, is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you. I do think that there is a reason why we're in this jurisdiction. But first, let me just say, all of us on this committee, no matter our party, are opposed to crime, and all of us have sympathy for victims of crime. But I will say also that we don't have jurisdiction. The federal government does not have jurisdiction over state and local prosecutions. That's up to the voters of each state and each locality. But if we were going to have a hearing that we have no jurisdiction to deal with, I think we might go to a place in the Speaker's District, which has much higher crime rates than New York City. As has been mentioned, Bakersfield has a homicide rate of 13.7 per 100,000 people. New York is at 5.5 for the same amount of residents. And I'll note also that 100% of the fatal officer-involved shootings involved a gun. And, you know, Mr. Jordan, in his opening statement, mentioned his sympathy for the police. We all have that. I also have sympathy for the officers who defended us against a MAGA mob, unlike some members on the other side of the aisle. I think it's pretty obvious that we're in New York because of the case of New York versus Donald J. Trump. But I'm also worried that we're not here about guns, because 80% of all the murders in the U.S. are committed with a gun. We had 150 mass shootings so far this year. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle have prevented any kind of sensible gun violence legislation from passing to keep us safe. Now, you know, we're not the only country in the world with people who want to do bad things or with people who are unstable, but we're the only country in the world that has mass shootings practically every other day. And that is something that's within our jurisdiction, and we ought to take some action. This is a choice that we are making to allow all the children of America to go into school worried that they're going to be the victim of a mass shooting. And it's a scandal that we have done nothing about it. Now, talking about the people versus Donald J. Trump, we don't have jurisdiction over that either. That's something that is a local prosecution, and it's entirely improper for the federal government or any committee of the United States to try and interfere in this matter. So having said that, I want to talk a little bit more about, or ask a little bit more about gun violence and what can be done about it. Ms. Fisher, it's been suggested, or Mr. Kessler, either of you, that somehow having more guns would make us safer. Do the statistics actually back that up, that having more guns makes for a safer community?
States with strong gun laws have lower rates of gun violence. And one of the things that's important to say here is that crime is going down in New York City, thankfully. But there is more that can be done by Congress to enact strong universal background checks, a strong extreme risk protection order law at the federal level, and to fund state laws. There's more that can be done to enact safe storage laws and to combat the trafficking crisis. And Congress is standing idly by and not doing anything.
Let me ask you about, some of our colleagues have suggested that we defund the prosecutor's office here in Manhattan. It's my understanding that the majority of the funds comes from an annual grant to the office's Witness Aid Services Unit that provides services to victims of crime. What would the impact be of eliminating those services, if you know, Ms. Kessler? Or Ms. Fisher?
Sure. We need to be investing and putting more resources into victim services and supporting victims. As you heard here today, we need to be giving victims more mental health support, more social support. We need to be helping them find access to compensation, not only for funeral expenses, for hospital expenses, to make up for lost income.
Let me just say, I want to thank all the witnesses, including the victims of crime. I fear that you are being used for a political purpose despite your sincerity.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentlelady's, the committee will be in order. The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Our criminal justice system is insane. It's dangerous, it's harmful, and it is destroying the fabric of our city. Time and again, our police officers make an arrest, and then the person who is arrested for assault, felonious assault, robberies, and gun possession, they're finding themselves back on the street within days, if not hours, after arrest. Eric Adams, New York mayor. My friends, the reason we are here in New York is because you have Democrats, you have citizens calling for some relief from this pain. And we are here not to use anyone, but to uplift the voices of brave people who are here to tell their story. Ms. Brame, do you feel used in this hearing?
Gentleman's recognized.
Ms. Brame, do you feel used?
Not.
Ms. Harrison?
I'm a willing participant.
Ms. Harrison, do you feel used? Tell you what, let me ask you it this way. Do you feel more used by this committee hearing, or do you feel more used by a criminal justice system that allowed people to kill people that you love and care about with no consequence?
The latter, and I'm beyond grateful for the opportunity to testify here on behalf of victims, because the Democrat Party, including Mr. Nadler and everybody here today, has ignored us in this city. And we need federal oversight. We need help. We're not getting any kind of help. And the services that she wants to keep funding are not being provided to the victims. I have a woman sitting outside who is a victim of domestic violence, who was conned by an immigrant, and she is receiving no services whatsoever. So until we get a thorough audit to the outcomes of the services being provided, no, we need to find out what's going wrong and get the services to where they need to be.
I am not here to criticize any New Yorkers, except maybe one, and that's because so many New Yorkers will soon become Florida voters. This is an iconic city. It's actually our nation's most iconic city. And it's not because of the beautiful architecture, and it's not because of the geography. It is because the sense of hustle that is so inherent to the people who come to New York to achieve their dreams. And increasingly, that hustle is being replaced with fear. Mr. Councilman Holden, you and I are from different parties. If we talked about 1,000 things, we'd probably disagree about a vast majority of them. But here's my simple question for you. Is fear a rising feature of life in New York, or is fear a declining feature of life in New York?
It is increasingly worrisome what we're going through in New York City. Fear is an everyday event in New York City. Taking the subway. My wife is Asian American. She will not get on the New York City subway. My daughter will not get on a New York City subway for fear, because many Asian Americans have been attacked.
But Mr. Kessler says there's just a lot of people here in Manhattan. You just have to take it. You just have to understand that this is going to be a violent place.
Which I found that insulting.
Well, Mr. DiGiacomo, you're here as the voice of law enforcement in many ways. And since the days of Cain and Abel, there has constantly been a violent criminal element as some feature of American society. And the lives we all get to live are lashed to whether or not we put that violent criminal element in charge, or whether or not we constrain it for the sake of people who want freedom. And so my question for you is, when the day one memo of Alvin Bragg changes the way resisting arrest is treated, so people can resist arrest against law enforcement and not actually face a consequence for that, what does that do to the enterprise of policing?
Well, it makes the officers and the detectives on the street, their job, that much harder. Everything becomes confrontational or physical, and they put themselves, the police officers and detectives, are in harm's way.
Well,
now,
we don't want to do that, but I have only a moment left, and I have to address this matter of crime rates that my colleagues keep talking about. And to the extent that there is an impact on crime rates in major cities, I would suggest that that is exactly what you get with the Sorosization of the United States justice system. And in places like New Orleans, Louisiana, in places like Tampa, Florida, in Jacksonville, Florida, in Tucson, Arizona, increasingly George Soros is putting in upwards of $40 million to elect 75 DAs to be able to engage in these downgrades. And by the way, not only are they downgrading the violent things, they can't even win the cases they try. Mr. Holden, you pointed out the fact that Alvin Bragg is actually terrible at losing in court. And since I don't have time, I would ask you for the record, since he keeps losing all of his cases, we might opine as to why, and we might seek a better utilization of the federal resources that we provide. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Let me indicate I abhor crime. I abhor victimization, the victims that suffer. I want to prevent crime. I want to pay tribute to all of the law enforcement in this room and outside, and those in Houston, Texas, from where I come from, of which I have a deep and abiding affection and relationship with. As a Democrat, I will not sit here, as my predecessor said, Barbara Jordan, and see the diminution of the Constitution, the destruction of what we believe in and our values. I want to stand here and be supportive of everyone who is before us, but I want to do it in a way that is befitting the patriotism of this nation. The very soldiers that are on front lines wearing uniforms are people of color and otherwise. I abhor anti-Semitism, if you will. I abhor people being violated through domestic violence, and it was Democrats who fought extensively for the Violence Against Women Act, which has put a lot of money in the state of New York and other states. Let us work together. Let us find facts that really address this question. And that is what I'm going to try to do. First, I think it is important to note that the monies that the Republicans want to cut are monies that would help victims. We don't want victims, but we need to have resources. My own crime victims in Houston say, we're lonely. We need to be taken care of after the incident. And I agree. And I brought money to the Houston Police Department. Let me ask Ms. Vaughn, there are many things that we can do better. Excuse me, Ms. Fisher. There are many things that we can do better. And I clearly like you to talk about the importance of a storage bill. I've introduced the Kimberly Vaughn Safe Storage Act. What does that do in terms of bringing down gun violence?
Thank
and
you,
my time is short, so I appreciate it.
Thank you, Representative. We need safe storage laws to ensure that children can't access guns that shouldn't have them, to ensure that individuals who are in crisis can't access them and potentially commit suicide and mass shootings. Safe storage laws work. We have a strong one here in New York State, and Congress should enact one as well.
And can I just ask a yes or no, are mandatory red flag laws good?
Yes.
Should we rush to Washington and implement a ban the assault weapons?
Yes.
And can we do better in passing stronger gun safety legislation? We know we've had one bill, but can we do better?
We absolutely can do better, and we need comprehensive reform, and we need it urgently for all Americans.
Mr. Kessler, can you quickly respond to the question of violence? Can you, under oath as you've taken, affirm that violence or gun violence in a myriad of ways is going down in this state? I just want to hear you say it again.
Yeah, it is absolutely true, and it's also 18% below the national average in New York City. And New York State has a far lower murder rate than the country as a whole.
Quickly, thank you very much. Ms. Fisher, what percentage of guns are found in New York come from other places?
Over 70% of guns that are used in crimes in New York City and across New York State come from out of state, the iron pipeline from weak gun law states, including Florida and the Carolinas and Georgia.
Let me ask the Councilmember Holden, thank you for your service. You said you're a lifelong New Yorker?
That's correct.
And you, therefore, lived in New York in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on?
Yep.
Did you say in an article recently, I've never seen the lawlessness we're seeing now?
Yep.
And so do you realize and recognize this pamphlet, Fear City, in the 1970s? And so apparently we've had some ups and downs. This is Fear City, a survival guide for visitors in New York City of New York by NYPD, 1975. I ask unanimous consent to put this in the record.
Without objection.
And so we've had our moments. We do better if we work together rather than we cast about what is bad and what isn't. Let's work together. Let's get the funds. Let's get the appropriate justice for these victims. Let me quickly go to this point. We are here wrongly because you're here rightly. You are here rightly. But we're here wrongly because District Attorney Bragg, because of Trump, has been called, he called him, a saurus-backed animal, a dog whistle. And then, of course, other Republicans have followed likely. By the way, Republicans have threatened to defund the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearm, that does a lot on trafficking. This office, because of these threats, white powder has come. He's had threatening and racially charged calls into the district attorney. I indicated to you my belief and love in democracy. I want justice for you. But this is an absurd and poor reflection of who we are as Americans, who I am as a Houstonian. And I believe in bringing people together. We need to bring people together and work on the solutions. I ask unanimous consent to place in the record 3 are charged with selling ghost guns, including assault weapons. I'm asking unanimous consent.
Yeah, without objection.
And the welcome to Fear City, unanimous consent?
Without objection.
With that, I yield back. I thank you, and I thank the witnesses out of the bottom of my heart.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Holden, you were born in New York City?
Yes.
You were raised in New York City, went to grade school and high school here in the city?
Yep.
Went to college in New York City? You got,
Yes.
I think I looked, you got an associate degree, an undergrad degree, postgrad degree, all from universities here in New York City. Is that right?
Yes, I did, Chair.
You're a professor at a university here in New York City?
Right, 44 years.
All your professional career has been spent here in New York City, is that right?
Yes.
And you received a Lifetime Achievement Award for your volunteer work from the Queen Civic Group. Is that
Yeah,
right? For your
yes.
work here in the city.
Yes.
You love this town, don't you?
I love it.
I mean, I think Mr. Gates is right. I think America loves this town.
Right.
Whether you're a Yankees fan, a Mets fan, a Giants fan, a Jets fan, the Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island, Broadway, Wall Street, Americans love this city. Maybe most, I think, Americans appreciate the people of this town and the example they showed the country after that tragic day of 9/11. Do you agree with all that, Mr. Holden?
I agree with that 100%.
Yeah. But right now, the policies being implemented by this district attorney are going to ruin this great city. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
Scary, isn't it? Scary what you see. It's scary what Miss Harrison's had to endure, what Mr. Albus had to endure, what Miss Brames had to endure, and what Mr. Borgen has had to endure. And it's driven by that day one memo. That day one memo which sent a message to this town, to the bad guys in this town, you can do bad things and you're not going to get prosecuted. Do you agree with all that, Mr. Holden?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, it's scary. Soft on crime policies are going to ruin this great city, and that's why we're here. It's happened in other cities, as Mr. Gates pointed out. That's why this is not the only hearing. We're going to have other hearings. We'll go to wherever we need to go. But this is something that has to happen, has to stop. Justice isn't supposed to be political. Now, Mr. Holden, you're a Democrat, right?
Yes, I am.
But it shouldn't matter. Republican or Democrat, I think as a lot of people said, it should not matter, should it? What's the answer, Mr. Holden? What would you recommend?
My allegiance is to my constituents. I live
Well
here. For
said.
71 years, I've lived in New York City. I've seen bad times, high crime, 2,000 murders a year in the 80s. I've not seen the lawlessness that I'm seeing today in New York City in my lifetime. That means we're afraid to go anywhere.
Let me just be clear. So in 71 years, your life here in this great city, it's never been as bad as it is today.
And I've had so many friends leaving this town because they just see the quality of life dropping. They go out on the street, there's people driving down the wrong way with electric scooters, there's people robbing stores. You know that all the pharmacies in New York City have to be under lock and key. You have to go in a case. It's so bad, these small crimes, that Mr. Bragg has said he's not going to prosecute. You don't send that message out there. And that's why we disagree. We're the same party, but we totally disagree on that. Again, my allegiance is not to the party. It's to my constituents and where I live. And again, I plan to live here, until I die. But I don't want to see it go down the drain.
Yeah. You're standing up for the folks you get to represent in Queens as part of the city council. Mr. Borgen, Ms. Fisher earlier said bad guys go into other states and buy guns illegally, and the Democrats' response is take away guns from law-abiding citizens. Is that going to work, Mr. Borgen?
Absolutely not. I just want to say one thing. I sit here and listen. You're on one side, you're on one side. When Ronald Reagan was president, him and Tip O'Neill had regular meetings, got together and worked together in Congress.
That's right.
I don't understand why I have to sit here, whether Republican or Democrat. I'm a Republican, by the way. I now vote in Florida, and I'm a registered voter in Florida. I have a Florida driver's license. Based on, I'm not planning to stay, but fact of the matter is, if everybody would work together and not sit here and say, this party says this about Trump, about this, it doesn't make any sense. But the fact of the matter is, the criminals will get guns either way. You can do whatever you want. The criminals are going to get guns. They always have gotten guns. It's not going to change. It's not going to change. So you can sit here till your face blue in the face. You can say Congress are going to outlaw gun sales across America. They're going to get guns.
Yep.
The criminals will get guns. And there's nothing you can do about it. That's life. And Mr. Kessler sits here and says, we have to sit and take it. I never heard someone say to me, you have to take crime. I live in Long Island. Crime has now come to my area out in the 5 towns, in a very nice suburban area. We have had robberies now in stores, and now the crime is coming toward me because I guess New York City's tapped out. They can't rob the pharmacies anymore. But the criminals are going to get guns, nothing you can do about it, absolutely nothing.
Bad guys aren't necessarily stupid. They're just bad. They're going to
just
figure
bad.
out a way to do bad things.
There's-
And the key is to put bad guys behind bars so they can't harm others. And when you send that message, things get better.
There's segments of society that are always going to be criminals. It's been from day one. Nothing you can do about it. But if Mr. Bragg would lock people up, it would save a lot of headaches in New York City and save lives.
Thank you, Mr. Borgen. Gentlemen, the chair now recognizes
We have
the
order.
gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is a sham hearing. It's not about crime in New York. It's an effort to impede and ultimately suppress the prosecution of Donald Trump. And if you don't believe it, then all you need to do is connect the dots. First, Manhattan District Attorney Bragg announced his criminal charges against ex-President Trump. Then, House Judiciary Republicans abused their power by subpoenaing testimony and records from D.A. Bragg about the ongoing prosecution. And next, they bring this sham hearing to Manhattan, supposedly about crime. But if my colleagues across the aisle were really concerned and really cared about reducing violent crime, they'd work with Democrats to pass common sense gun laws. There are too many gun deaths in this country, and that's why I have joined with my fellow Democrats to co-sponsor bills that would ban assault weapons, strengthen background checks, and fund research into gun violence prevention. Meanwhile, MAGA Republicans continue to resist even the most basic reforms like universal background checks. If Republicans really wanted to stop violent crime, they would be in D.C. right now, working with Democrats to pass common sense gun legislation. Instead, like jackbooted thugs, they've descended on New York City using violent crime as their pretext. The MAGA Republican extremists are not interested in gun violence or even knife violence. The Republican witnesses who have used their time to criticize District Attorney Bragg have served as props in a MAGA Broadway production. The real purpose in coming to New York City,
Can we have order?
the real purpose in coming to New York City,
Gentlemen, will suspend.
stop the clock.
Gentlemen, will suspend. For the audience, I've said several times now that the committee has to be in order. If anyone continues, then we're going to have to escort some people out.
Please don't talk down. Please don't talk down to us witnesses, please.
Yep. The gentleman from Georgia controls the time. Mr. Johnson, you can proceed.
The real purpose in coming to New York City is to harass, intimidate, and threaten Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg. We are here because Manhattan District Attorney Bragg announced the indictment of former President Trump, and MAGA United States House Republicans have responded by using their power to try to help ex-President Trump beat the 34 counts of fraud that he has been charged with. MAGA Republican extremists have defended the January 6th insurrectionists, and they are out here today serving as Trump's bulldogs, trying to scare a duly elected district attorney from following the facts where they lead and enforcing the law. It is just one more sign that MAGA Republicans are a clear and present danger to our democracy and are actively working to undermine the rule of law, not just federally, but also on the state and local levels. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from New York's 18th District, the Honorable Congressman Adriano Espaillat.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you, my colleague Hank Johnson, for yielding time. Mr. Chairman, first I want to express my condolences, my deepest condolences to both Ms. Harrison and Ms. Brain. And Mr. Alba, I was proud to see your community, our community, rally around you and other bodegueros, and I applauded D.A. Bragg's decision to drop the charges against you. During the 80s and 90s, before I was involved in public service, as a regular citizen of New York, I fought crime and drugs during the crack wars in northern Manhattan. During those years, the 34th precinct used to average over 100 homicides. Let me repeat this: over 100 homicides a year. Myself and my family members were held at gunpoint during those years. Held up at gunpoint. I don't know if any of you here have been held up at gunpoint. This is deeply personal to me. This year, the 34th precinct has witnessed 0 homicides. And last year, although far too many, that same precinct in northern Manhattan witnessed 5 homicides. From 100 to 5, and to this year, 0. But let me say something to you, Mr. Chairman. The common denominator in most homicides across the country is a gun. It's a gun. 80% of the homicides in this country are committed by guns. A young man murdered on 137th Street. A gun.
The gentleman from Georgia yields back.
And you guys brandish your pins with AR-15. Reprehensible.
The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by quoting a short excerpt from an important study and legal memorandum that was issued in November by the Heritage Foundation. Listen to this. It's entitled, "The Blue City Murder Problem." And this summary statement is a message to all Americans.
Gentlemen, suspend for just a second. I would ask that the audience be quiet. The gentleman from Louisiana controls the time. If we could stop, but the press would please move so we can conduct the hearing. We move aside. Capitol Police, if you could help us just clear that out. The press will be given ample opportunity to talk to folks. We need to clear out and be quiet during the hearing. Committee will be in order. Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Here's the quote. "Your public safety as a resident is dramatically impacted by your district attorney and whether he or she is a George Soros-funded rogue prosecutor or a law and order prosecutor, by your police department, and by whether the local politicians support and adequately fund the police and prosecutors' offices." It goes on. "This is why the Soros rogue prosecutor movement has concentrated its fire at identifying, recruiting, and funding candidates for local district attorney races. By elevating pro-criminal and anti-victim zealots into office, the rogue prosecutor movement destabilizes the safety of our communities, treats criminals as victims and police as the criminals, and ignores real victims. America's sky-high murder rates, for example, are almost exclusively cabined in cities run by Democrats and with Democrat district attorneys, many of whom are bought and paid for by George Soros. Why are we beginning our crime wave field hearings in New York City? Because this is one of the most egregious examples in America. Alvin Bragg is the poster child for exactly what was just described. Ms. Brame, I want to thank you for your compelling testimony today and sharing the shocking and tragic story of your son, Sergeant Hassan Korea's gang assault and vicious murder by 4 criminals he did not know. In your written statement submitted today, you wrote this. You said, quote, "D.A. Bragg has demonstrated over and over again that he has no regard or concern for human life or victims of crime by instituting his ADAs to not prosecute violent recidivists and ultimately release them back to the streets to victimize and terrorize more innocent New Yorkers," unquote. You heard Mr. Nadler and Mr. Kessler and others share their manipulated statistics this morning, suggesting that New York City is, quote, "one of the safest big cities in America." But you and other New Yorkers don't agree with that, I know. Mr. Holden just said our people are afraid to go anywhere because this is the worst lawlessness in the city's history. How do you respond to these claims that this is just a magical, safe city right now?
Well, I think that the average New Yorker doesn't care nothing about no statistics, okay? Especially in the black and brown communities. We care about the mothers who have to visit the morgue to identify their dead child's body. We care about the mothers who have to lean into the coffin and watch them lower that top down on that child and they know they'll never see them again. We care about being able to let our child go out to the park and play without getting shot in their stroller. We care about not getting raped in elevators. We don't care nothing about your statistics. You cannot convince us to not believe our lying eyes with your numbers, all right? Because we see it with our very eyes, day in and day out, especially in the poor black and brown communities, where none of you in this room would even step foot in.
Ms. Brame, you're so right. And they're changing the subject. They're doing their best to change the subject here and obscure the facts because the facts are difficult for them to face. The objective fact is that Manhattan has instituted pro-crime, anti-victim policies that have resulted in an increase in violent crime and created this dangerous situation in the community. And in America's once great cities that was the symbol of freedom and opportunity and liberty. According to the NYPD data, New York City saw a 23% surge in major crimes in 1 year since Alvin Bragg took over. That is the fact. We have a violent crime epidemic here, and everybody in America knows it because we see the videos played out on our television, local news, every single night of what's going on here in the city. I just want to say this, and I'm almost out of time, but I've shared in this committee before the long list of statements from leading Democrats in Congress and the leading Democrats on this very committee who specifically and aggressively called for the defunding of the police. And as a result, in 2020 in New York City, officials cut $1 billion from the police department's 2021 budget. These are the completely foreseeable and obvious effects of these soft-on-crime policies that are advanced by Soros-funded DAs. Alvin Bragg is, in my view, probably the worst offender. And they're trying to manipulate the facts. They're trying to change it. But I thank you all for being here. I yield the remainder of my time.
Committee will be in order. The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Almost 3 weeks ago, is the microphone on?
Yeah, just pull it close.
Almost 3 weeks ago, Donald J. Trump was indicted by a grand jury in Manhattan on dozens of counts of fraud in connection with a hush money payment scheme in which his personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, previously went to jail. Since the former president's indictment, the Manhattan District Attorney has been the subject of countless death threats and racist diatribes. Others have made ugly appeals to anti-Semitism in an effort to attack the proceedings. And this committee has used every means at its disposal to disrupt, interrupt, and interfere with the prosecution, demanding documents it has no right to obtain and no jurisdiction to demand, subpoenaing a former district attorney, deputy district attorney, and threatening to subpoena the DA himself, and now holding this hearing in Manhattan in a vain attempt to intimidate or embarrass the prosecutorial authority. Now, the majority denies that this is the purpose of today's hearing. They would have you believe it is a mere coincidence that all of a sudden and out of the blue, the chairman decided that the state of New York is a wonderful place to do a hearing. Not the chairman's home state of Ohio with its high rates of murder, but New York State. And of all the cities in New York, they would pick New York City. And of all the boroughs in New York, they pick Manhattan. Apparently, Manhattan is just lovely this time of year. What a remarkable coincidence we are meant to believe. Of all the gin joints and all the towns in all the world, we just happened to walk into this one. How absurd. Of course, this is not a coincidence at all. Instead, it is the GOP leadership in Congress doing what it has done best for the last 6 years, and that is to act as the criminal defense counsel for Donald J. Trump. Well, let me tell you this.
Capitol Police. Gentlemen will suspend. Capitol Police. Capitol Police will remove the gentleman from the audience.
Let me tell you this. Let me tell you this.
Gentlemen.
Let me tell you this. Let me tell you this. Donald J. Trump.
Gentlemen will suspend till we got order. Gentlemen will suspend. The audience has to be in order. Capitol Police. Capitol Police. Sir.
Can we have order?
We're working on it, Mr. Schiff. Gentlemen, Capitol Police, please remove the gentleman from the audience. No, you got to go. You got to go. I'm sorry. I've given you several warnings. You got to go, unfortunately.
He's from my district.
It was a very unfortunate attack on Ralph Nader.
Committee will be in order. Committee will be in order. The gentleman from California.
Those comments about Ralph Nader are way out of line. Of course, it is not a coincidence that we are here in Manhattan. Instead, it is the GOP leadership in Congress doing what it has done best over the last 6 years, and that is to act as the criminal defense counsel for Donald J. Trump. Well, let me tell you this. Donald Trump doesn't need the lawyers on this committee to be his criminal defense lawyer. He has plenty of those already. Nor is that the role of Congress. Quite the opposite. Our role should be to defend the rule of law, not tear it down. We should be defending the principle that no one is above the law, not attempting to establish a new principle that if you are politically powerful enough, you get a pass. We should be defending the independence of the grand jury and the safety of a public servant enforcing the law, not adding to the dangers to both. The Manhattan District Attorney has the burden of proving Donald Trump guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. A jury of ordinary citizens will have the responsibility of determining whether he has met that burden. That this process will be the same for a former president as it would be for his lawyer or his driver or his doorman or his neighbor is the strength of a democracy, not its weakness. The first thing Chairman Jordan said today was that this hearing is about the administration of justice, but more accurately, it is about an effort to interfere with the administration of justice. He said that here in Manhattan, the scales of justice are being weighed down by politics, and they are, but only today. And by this committee's actions in trying to intimidate the Manhattan DA for having the audacity to believe that in America, being rich, being powerful, even being president of the United States does not entitle you to violate the law with impunity. There was a time in America when both parties used to believe in the rule of law, but sadly those days are over. One of America's two great political parties believes that political might makes right, and more than right, it means that you are beyond the reach of the law and beyond accountability. The more power, the less justice. But this is not democracy. This is the antithesis of democracy. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all of our witnesses being here today. Thank you for sharing your compelling stories. I would just say, Mr. Morgan, after hearing what you've heard today, I think you probably understand why it's real tough to sit down and have a logical, cogent argument on how we might jointly, with nonpartisan affiliation, try to solve some of these problems. What do you think?
And talks about you guys, Republicans, about Trump. Hey, while Trump was in office, he's busy holding hearings trying to get him out for 4 years. So I don't think you have the right to say that you politicized when you were in power. You tried to get Trump out, you couldn't get him out. Let's face reality, you tried. The dossier was a fake, everything what it was. You tried to get him. He's sitting there laughing. That's very nice. And the other Democrats are telling us that we're all props for sitting here. Please don't talk down to us. It's really not nice.
Thanks, Mr. Borg.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to just read some. These are not by a Republican. These aren't from Republican members of this committee. These are just comments here. This is what an individual said. I would add that it's not so much from necessarily federal funding, but it's something that I do want to spend more time on and focus on, and use the plight use the pulpit representing the district in public safety. I think a lot of people walk around the city very scared right now, and the violent crime wave is very concerning. This individual also said, I think people are scared to go on the subway in the whole district. I've heard it from all over the place, from the wealthy areas in Tribeca, to Chinatown, to Borough Park, to Sunset Park. I think a lot of people are afraid. He also said, I'm very concerned about the safety in the city. He also said, I've been part of this community defending the victims and trying to protect the public for my whole career, and I think that those experiences resonate with people in different ways for different reasons, close quote. We cannot allow people to just continue to cycle through the system because it's demoralizing to the cops and it gives everyone a perception of danger. He also said, whether or not the data says that it's safe or not, there is a perception in the city that it is not safe, and one of the reasons for that is the perpetual recidivism that is going on, close quote. He also said, quote, you've got people randomly being shot on the subways. You've got people randomly being thrown into car trunks and driven to remote places and shot. There's an insecurity not felt in 25 years. It's scary to me and far away the number one issue, close quote. That didn't come from anybody on this side of the aisle. It didn't even come from any of you at the table. It came from Mr. Goldman over there. We sit in his district. He knows that there's a crime problem. And we've been hearing about a study. Let me refer you to the heritage study that my colleague referred to, and I ask that it's
objection.
Thank you. Quote, when you remove the crime-infested, homicide-riddled cities from the state murder rate featured in the Third Way study, which was co-authored by Mr. Kessler, you dramatically lower the murder rate for that state, upending their conclusions, his conclusions, and exposing the piece for what it really is, a straightforward attempt at political projection dressed up as a study. That's what you've been hearing about to rebut the stories and the facts of the lives of the victims and the witnesses and those who live in this city today. Mr. Holden, why won't your family go take the subway, the mass transit system in this city?
What they've experienced when my daughter took the subway the other day for the first time, she says, I'm not going back because I felt unsafe. People talking to themselves, people screaming. It is terrible. And by the way, if you want to cherry pick numbers from the other side, and I'm a Democrat, but I'm against what I've heard about these stats. Downloaded from the NYPD this morning, 25% increase in all the 7 major crimes in New York City in a 2-year period. 26% in the 13-year period. For Manhattan North, Manhattan South, 59% increase in a 2-year period in the 7 major crimes, 17% in the 13-year period. For all of New York City, and this again is from NYPD, so cherry pick your own numbers, but this is overall. 45% increase in the 2-year period in crime, in the 7 major crimes, and a 23% in the 13-year. So this is what we're facing, and this is what we go to work, and we fought so hard in the 90s to stop this crime wave that we had in New York City, and we did it. But now it's being rolled back to the bad old days.
Yield back.
I think the gentleman yields back. Let me just, before going to Mr. Cicilline, we've been at this 2 hours. The witness is fine. If any, because we'll keep going. If you need a break, just please let us know. The gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 30 seconds to Mr. Goldman from New York.
I appreciate Mr. Bigg's reference to some of the concerns that we have about public safety because it is something that is shared across the aisle. The problem is that you are using this as a political stunt unrelated to real concerns about public safety around this country. Manhattan has the 6th fewest murders out of the top 50 cities in this country. So we all know why you're here. So don't play the political games. You want to have a meaningful conversation? Let's talk. I yield back.
I want to thank the witnesses for being here today and, of course, sharing some very painful stories about your loss. I want to start by emphasizing that keeping Americans safe is one of the most, if not the most important responsibilities that we have in government. It's one of our most important callings as lawmakers. And I was mayor of a city and presided over the lowest crime rate in 30 years, serving as a public safety commissioner. So I understand this very deeply. But my colleagues, sadly, are not here to meaningfully work on public safety solutions. This hearing was called for a purpose, to intimidate a district attorney for doing his job and upholding the rule of law. And you know how I know this? Because our colleagues consistently vote against laws that would increase public safety and ignore facts on what actually decreases crime. Gun violence is now the leading cause of death of children in America. And it kills 40,000 Americans a year.
We need to be in order.
And yet my colleagues...
The gentleman suspend just for a second.
I'd ask that the clock stop,
yes,
please.
Clock stop. We'll be happy to do that. We need to stop the conversations over here. The gentleman... Gentleman deserves to be heard. The committee guests will please refrain from talking and chatting so that Mr. Cicilline can make his presentation and ask his questions. Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gun violence is now the leading cause of death of children in America and kills 40,000 Americans a year. Yet my colleagues vote repeatedly against even the most common sense gun violence prevention measures. They vote against getting assault weapons off the streets, despite the previous assault weapons ban that drastically reduced gun violence. They vote against alerting people to active shooters. They vote against safe storage and red flag laws. They vote against community-based crime prevention programs. They vote against background checks. And the list goes on and on. And more than that, they brought us here today to attack a district attorney who has actually seen a decrease in violent crime during his tenure, all because he dared to hold Donald Trump accountable. So please spare me this suggestion that this is about a sincere interest in finding solutions to crime. This is about your agenda to earn the admiration and support and good wishes of the former President of the United States. But I, for one, would actually like to hear about some actual solutions to public safety, and particularly to gun violence in our communities. And that brings me to my first question. Ms. Fisher, how do our gun laws, or lack thereof, contribute to America's gun violence epidemic? And is the rate of gun violence in this country and the rate of gun death comparable in any other developed country in the world?
Thank you, Representative. The gun violence rate in the United States is 26 times higher than every other high-income country. So we are comparatively a much more dangerous place to live. And though violent crime, and I strongly push forward that gun violence is violent crime and should be considered as a part of this hearing, violent crime is going down in New York City according to law enforcement's own data. However, we could be doing so much more to ensure that New Yorkers are protected and all Americans are protected by enacting comprehensive universal background checks, by having a licensing system and requiring a permit to purchase. We could also be banning the assault weapons that are most commonly used in mass shootings that are killing our children every day.
And one of the things that I think that Congress has a responsibility to look at, although we don't have jurisdiction over state criminal prosecutions, obviously, or local prosecutions, what is the evidence with respect to the focus on exclusively arrest and incarceration, but how do we prevent crimes? What are the good strategies? Because, frankly, by the time someone's a victim of a crime, we've already failed. Our goal should be to prevent crime. So what does the evidence say with respect to those two different strategies?
We need to be investing in prevention, largely because there's so many guns that are being trafficked from out of state. We need to be investing in our communities. And that's with resources towards community violence intervention strategies and prevention programs, including in schools, more trauma support for victims, more resources, better housing, all of those issues in terms of the inequities that are impacting especially impoverished Black and brown communities in this country and in this city need to be addressed as a public health crisis, and we need to be investing in prevention.
Thank you. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman, Ms. Tiffany is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. DiGiacomo, would you rather have sympathy for the police, or would you rather have respect from elected leaders?
Well, respect and sympathy. It's a very difficult time time. In my 40 years now, this is probably the most difficult time in policing that I've ever seen. But yeah, respect is important, of course.
Do soft on crime policies lead to less gun violence?
I believe so, yes.
So you believe going soft on crime is going to cause there to be less gun violence in your city?
No, not less. Soft on crime is going to cause more gun violence.
Okay, I'll state it this way then. Do soft on crime policies lead to more gun violence?
Yes.
Ms. Harrison and Ms. Brame, the ranking member said this city is safer. Is this city safer in your mind, Ms. Harrison?
No, I have a lot of friends through my advocacy that live here that are considering moving their entire families.
Ms. Brame, is this city safer under District Attorney Bragg?
Absolutely not. There's all kinds of criminal elements roaming the street, free to do whatever they want.
Mr. Holden, the District Attorney's Office conceded they used $5,000 in federal funds, which are authorized by us here, for purposes other than fighting violent crime here in Manhattan. Do you agree with the District Attorney's decision to do that?
No, I don't. And I disagree with most of what DA Bragg's is about, especially the soft on crime. But what's happened in New York City, the reason why our crime, and it's not going down, it's going up if you look at the trends, we have the lowest incarceration rate of any major city in the United States. I'll repeat that. The lowest incarceration rate of, let's say, 40 of the biggest cities, New York City has the lowest. And that's because Mayor de Blasio, before Mayor Adams, started releasing everyone from jail. So, of course, crime was going to go up, and it skyrocketed in 2020. So that's the reason. We still, I believe, we have to arrest more people. DA Bragg will disagree. And they should go to jail when they commit a crime.
So, Mr. Holden, in regards to so there's this federal funding that comes in and it's not being used to fight violent crime. Is it, as an elected representative, do you view it as inappropriate that those of us that are responsible for those dollars going to fighting crime, using federal funds, is it inappropriate for us to review how those dollars are being spent?
Yes, certainly we should review it, yes.
Mr. Holden, have you been asked to be on any of the major networks to deliver your message? Have you been asked, for example, to be on CNN to deliver your message?
I've been asked, not from CNN, but I have been asked on other major networks, yes.
And you've shared those comments. Ms. Brame, Ms. Harrison, have you been asked to be on one of the major networks to tell your story?
Not CNN.
Ms. Harrison?
No, not CNN, not MSNBC. They refuse to even acknowledge that victims are a part of this hearing.
So let's talk about, we hear percentages. Time after time we're hearing percentages. In 2022, as a result of a 7% increase in 110 more people that got raped here in New York City. Those are almost all women, I'm sure. 110 people. Auto theft. 3,256 more carjackings here in New York as a result of this soft on crime. Transit crimes, people being pushed off from subways, right? 521 more people. 521 more people. 30% more? That's 521 more people. That's what we're seeing, ladies and gentlemen. These are real people that are being harmed. I just want to conclude with this, Mr. Chairman. I'm so glad we're having this first hearing in New York, but I want you to come to my state. I want you to come to Milwaukee, where we had a district attorney. Here's his quote when he started out. Is there going to be an individual I divert or put into a treatment program who's going to go out and kill somebody? You bet. Milwaukee has 10% of the population, and they have 25% of the crime. Mr. Kessler, that's the problem, is the Soros prosecutors are not doing their job. And in Wisconsin, now we've got a Soros Supreme Court justice. The people of Wisconsin better hang on, because violent crime is going to get worse. Come to Milwaukee, Mr. Chairman, for the next hearing.
Gentleman's time's expired. Ms. Scanlon is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Our constituents elect us to make their lives better. They send us to Washington to work on the issues that impact American families, whether it's healthcare, jobs, the cost of prescription drugs, infrastructure, clean air and water, climate rescue, and of course, safe communities and schools. But every day in Congress, we are seeing the right-wing extremists who control the House failing all of us, choosing publicity over progress, choosing politics over people, and choosing protecting the disgraced and now indicted former president rather than protecting our democracy. Today, at the urging of the former president and his lawyers, the chairman has dragged the entire House Judiciary Committee to New York, inserting the federal government into a purely state and local matter with no credible pretense of jurisdiction. And he's making the American taxpayer, and especially the New Yorkers, who he claims to be so concerned about, making those taxpayers pay for this foolishness. This isn't governance. It's not working for the American people. It's grandstanding. It's a stunt. Just look at all the cameras here. And every second of it is preventing us from being able to do the real work that the people who elected us expect us to do in Congress. To our witnesses here today who've shared their pain and trauma in being victims of crime and violence, I am so sorry for the impact that has had on you and your families. Anyone listening to you has to be moved by what you've experienced. And I applaud your courage in trying to take that pain and move to change things going forward. But I fear that you have been re-victimized by this hearing, because this hearing is not going to provide that change. It's not a serious effort to make our communities safer. Our Republican colleagues aren't in New York City to prevent crime. They're here to protect someone who's been charged with committing crimes. And how do we know that? Look at the time, place, and manner of this hearing. We know that the timing isn't a coincidence, because as soon as it became obvious that the Manhattan District Attorney was getting ready to charge Mr. Trump with crimes, Mr. Trump's lawyers sent a letter to the chairman telling him to use the full powers of Congress to go after the Manhattan DA. We know that the place is important because the choice of place for this hearing isn't a coincidence. It's about protecting Mr. Trump because it's being held in the city where Mr. Trump was indicted and arrested just 2 weeks ago. If this hearing were focused on fighting crime, as several people have mentioned, there are other jurisdictions that have much higher rates of crime. And as to the manner of this hearing, we know that it's about protecting Mr. Trump because it's being led by the disgraced former president's closest allies, the ones who benefit the most if he can beat the criminal charges here in New York, or if they can intimidate the Manhattan DA or the other prosecutors across the country who are investigating other alleged crimes. Crime prevention is a serious topic, and it deserves serious discussion, but that's not what this hearing is about. Instead, we're seeing a circus, a performance by partisan politicians who've hitched their wagons to the Trump train. So I and my colleagues refuse to sit idly by while families across this country, from Alabama to Louisville to Nashville to Uvalde to Buffalo to Boulder, while they're mourning the loss of their loved ones to gun violence. We stand ready to pass legislation to address the serious issues facing all Americans if our Republican colleagues will let us. Now, Ms. Fisher, you and several others have mentioned the iron pipeline, the route through which many of the crime guns in states like New York and Pennsylvania are acquired. Just last year, the ATF intercepted 400 illegal guns from southern states that were being sent to my community in Philadelphia. Can you speak to the impact of lax gun laws in states that lack more specific gun laws, the impact that it has on gun violence is in cities like New York and Pennsylvania, Philadelphia?
Absolutely. Thank you, Representative. Because traffickers are able to easily and illegally obtain guns In states with weak gun laws like Florida or Georgia or the Carolinas, they are able to easily purchase lots of guns and traffic them into neighborhoods that have been disproportionately impacted by structural and systemic inequities for decades. And we're talking about vulnerable communities that are already lacking in access to resources. And because of that, those guns are being used in crimes, and also because gun carrying is more likely when people feel afraid and they are feeling more powerful.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentlelady,
I would